More than 4 years the automaker CEO seeming to break ranks with much of corporate America right now, delivering some harsh words about President Trump's tariff plans, a 25% tariff on all cars that are not made in the United States. If they're made in the United States, there's absolutely no tariff. It began as a whisper in Detroit, a quiet conversation behind factory doors. And then it erupted like a shockwave across the industrial heart of America. Ford Motor Company, the symbol of American steel, sweat, and scale, had just taken a blow that no one saw coming. Factories closed, workers sent home, production lines frozen, and at the center of it all, tariffs. Not from a foreign power, but from Washington. Before we continue, hit that like button to help us beat the YouTube algorithm and to show your support. On May 17, Ford stunned the nation by announcing it would shut down several of its most iconic U.S. assembly lines. The Chicago plant, where the Ford Explorer and Lincoln Aviator once rolled out by the thousands, went quiet. Michigan Assembly, home of the Bronco and Ranger, halted movement. And with it, thousands of workers were told, "Go home. Wait for a call. No one knows when it is coming." The reason? Tariffs. Not the kind that protect, the kind that punish. The kind that were promised to bring jobs back and instead sent them spiraling. President Donald Trump's trade policy had finally reached the assembly line. A sweeping 25% tax on all imported parts and vehicles meant to punish China and Mexico ended up hammering America's own factories. Ford announced it was facing an earnings hit of over $1.5 billion in 2025. A financial gut punch that no company, not even Ford, could absorb. And so the shutdown began. It did not end with Ford. Across the Midwest, ripple effects exploded. General Motors scrambled to revise its production lines, laying off hundreds while quietly shifting some truck assembly back to Indiana. Stellantis, the parent of Chrysler and Dodge, idled entire plants in Canada and Mexico. But the pain bled straight into Michigan and Indiana, where 900 workers at component plants were laid off overnight. Ford tried to hold the line. It launched emergency pricing changes. The Mustang Mach-E, the Maverick, and the Bronco Sport, all made in Mexico, had their prices raised by nearly $2,000 to offset the tariffs. For customers, the shock came fast. For dealerships, it came hard. And for Ford, it still was not enough. Before we continue, hit that subscribe button to show your support to our channel. Behind the scenes, executives warned that even more cuts might be coming. Tariffs had spiked costs on everything from steel to electronics. The Lincoln Nautilus, imported from China, was now too expensive to compete in showrooms. Ford halted exports to China entirely, losing access to one of the world's largest auto markets. The message was clear: trade war was no longer theory. It was policy. And it was hurting. Trump's response? He did not flinch. When reporters asked about Ford's production freeze, he called it expected. Then he doubled down. They should have brought production back a long time ago, he said. These tariffs are about America first. The statement sent chills through every boardroom in the auto industry. If the president could shrug off Ford's collapse, who was next? The warning signs were everywhere. Stellantis furloughed its SUV production in Mexico for an entire month. Parts stopped flowing. Assembly stopped moving. Workers went silent. Then the layoffs hit, 5 U.S. stamping plants tied to those same models. Morale evaporated. Executives ducked cameras, and the union, for the first time in years, openly turned on the company. This was no longer about pressure. It was about survival. At GM's Fort Wayne truck plant, where Silverado and Sierra pickups are built, the company tried to make a stand. They added a shift. They hired 200 workers. They restarted a plant that had paused for retooling. The goal? Build more trucks on U.S. soil to avoid the tariffs. For now, it worked. But behind that short-term win was a long-term warning. If supply chains do not adapt, even the most loyal plants could fall. Nissan began canceling U.S. orders for certain SUVs made in Mexico. Toyota slowed shipments. Honda raised prices. The storm was not passing. It was strengthening. And then came the customers. New car prices jumped in April, not just by a few dollars, but by over 2.5% in a single month. That was the highest spike in years. Dealerships warned that buyers were rushing to sign contracts before the next price hike. But inventory was thinning. Deliveries were stalling. And the models that once lined the lots were vanishing. Ford tried to keep pace. It offered employee pricing to everyone, a move usually reserved for desperate times. The goal was simple: keep sales moving even as costs soared. But the gamble only bought time. The math no longer worked. At every turn, the supply chain was failing. Auto parts made in Mexico were now 25% more expensive. Cars assembled in Canada were taxed at the border. Components from China, from batteries to chips, faced duties of up to 30%. And the companies that depended on them were being squeezed to the edge. Ford CEO Jim Farley called the new reality the fairest fight in decades. He meant it as optimism. But behind the scenes, Ford was revising its forecasts, slashing guidance, and trying to explain to shareholders how a company that builds nearly 4 out of every 5 of its vehicles in America was still losing. And then came the layoffs. In cities like Kokomo and Toledo, workers who had been spared in the last recession were finally hit. Component lines were shut down. Entire shifts erased. And the communities that depend on those wages, the diners, the grocery stores, the repair shops, began to feel it. At the state level, governors called emergency meetings. In Indiana, labor boards issued warnings about rising unemployment. In Michigan, city mayors begged Washington for relief. But the tariffs held. Wall Street watched in disbelief. Auto stocks stumbled. Supplier shares cratered. And analysts began warning that if the tariffs persisted, the industry could lose more than 1 million sales this year alone. And what was the message from Washington? No changes. Trump's administration insisted that the pain was temporary, that companies would return, that factories would reopen. But inside the industry, no one was waiting for help. Ford began reconsidering future product launches. GM reassigned engineers. Stellantis froze hiring. And in the background, a whisper turned into a scream. Is this what America first looks like? Because what is being lost now is not just money. It is momentum. The North American auto industry was once a marvel, a tightly integrated machine spanning 3 countries, thousands of suppliers, and tens of millions of vehicles. Now, that system is fracturing. Ford cannot simply move all production to the US overnight. Neither can GM. Their supply chains were built over decades, optimized for cost and speed. Breaking them apart is not just expensive. It is dangerous. And yet, that is what the tariffs are forcing. Companies are now making decisions not based on efficiency, but on survival. Shift production here. Pause shipping there. Cancel orders. Raise prices. Hope. And through it all, the worker is the one left behind. For every job added in Indiana, another is lost in Michigan. For every shift increased in Fort Wayne, another is paused in Windsor. It is a shell game. And the pieces are running out. The political divide is growing.